Hello, I'm Laurie Vanderplug, the Director of the Office of Special Education Programs in the U.S. Department of Education. Thank you for inviting me to your 2020 Inclusion Collaborative State Conference. The Office of Special Education Program, or OSEP, administers the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDEA. We are dedicated to improving results for children with disabilities ages birth through 21 by supporting states and local programs to provide comprehensive services under IDEA. OSEP also administers Part D of the IDEA, which funds national activities under technical assistance, personnel development, technology, and parent training to improve outcomes for children with disabilities and their families. The theme of your meeting is Inclusion Years Transform, which is such an appropriate theme given the challenging context we are working in right now. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it so systems, schools, early childhood programs, and providers have had to transform their practice to provide children with disabilities a free, appropriate public education while protecting children's health and safety and those. We know COVID-19 has impacted the way that children with disabilities have received services, as systems and schools have had to shift to remote or online delivery methods. It has also required us to transform some of our thinking on how services can be provided equitably and how children with disabilities access and meaningfully participate in high-quality inclusive settings. So to provide inclusive services during this time, we still need to keep in mind the foundation of what inclusion is and the benefits of high-quality, inclusive practices for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities. Inclusion is likely to look different than it had prior to the pandemic for many children and families. This is the time to think outside the box and remember that inclusion is not a place or a classroom, but high-quality practices that can be provided in person or in a hybrid or a virtual setting. We also need to remember the foundation of IDEA is that services are individualized to children's strengths and needs, and this has not changed with the pandemic. In fact, with the ever-changing context, the individualization may even be more critical right now. To implement inclusion, state and local agencies must be intentional and thoughtful in their planning and decision-making on services for children with disabilities and their families. It involves partnerships, and one of the tracks in your conference, partnering with other providers and special and general educators and parents of children with disabilities and parent organizations. I want to emphasize that for children with disabilities to be supported and successful, it's critical for families to be engaged in the discussions and decision-making. We also want to be collaborative partners with you and have worked to provide guidance and resources. Since the start of the pandemic, the department has released guidance underscoring that states and local systems must provide a free, appropriate public education to children with disabilities, even if the school buildings are closed. We continue to release guidance in response to questions we have received from the field on the implementation of IDEA. All of our guidance can be found on the Department of Education's COVID-19 website. You can use this guidance to help make decisions about providing services for children with disabilities and their families. The investments that OSEP funds have been working overtime to develop resources for you to use in your practice. The National Center for Systemic Improvement is serving as a hub for resources on reopening schools and distance learning for students with disabilities in K-12, whereas the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center houses resources for resuming in-person services and remotely servicing infants, toddlers, and preschool children with disabilities and their families. I hope that you can take time to go through these websites and explore these resources. I also want to highlight the Parent Training and Information Centers, our PTIs, and Community Parent Resource Centers, the CPRCs, which provide families with information about a range of topics to better understand the nature of their children's disabilities and their rights and responsibilities under IDEA. During this time, the center has provided a wealth of information for families on how to access resources, such as internet services or strategies to support virtual learning at home. The Center for Parent Information and Resources houses materials for the PTIs and the CPRCs to use with families and has curated several resources for families on working with schools and has developed materials such as participating in virtual IEP meetings. In addition, OSEP held 3 national webinars this summer on resources from our centers and partner national professional organizations that support continuity of learning for children with disabilities. These webinars are available on our OSEP Ideas That Work website. Also available on this website are briefs that provide evidence-based and promising practices on distance learning. I know that this is a stressful time. There are a lot of resources out there to support you, and we want you to have access to them. If you're not finding what you need, please reach out to our centers, your professional organizations, and the Inclusion Collaborative staff to help guide you to the resources you need. I wish you a wonderful conference and a safe and successful school year. Enjoy this opportunity to build and transform your Inclusion Your Powers. And on behalf of OSEP, thank you for what you are doing to support the children. Stay safe and stay healthy.
I'm Dr. Mary Ann Dewan, Santa Clara County Superintendent of Schools, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Annual Inclusion Collaborative Virtual State Conference. This year's conference theme is Inclusioneers Transform. I'm sure we can all agree that we've experienced many transformations to education this year, which have even impacted our ability to meet in person. From rapidly pivoting to distance learning environments, to providing essential services to our students and families, to partnering with local city, county, and state leaders, as well as public and private organizations statewide, to continue to serve our students and families. Our experiences navigating education in a global pandemic have been challenging, but are revealing our strength and resilience. These challenges have also served as poignant reminders that there is still much work to be done. Recent tragedies in our country have highlighted inequitable practices throughout systems. These unprecedented times have sparked conversations and brought to the forefront active participation on many platforms aimed at creating the most inclusive and equitable education environments possible. These are important conversations that we must continue to have so that we can take the necessary, actionable, and meaningful steps towards attaining the educational system all of our students deserve and need to thrive. The Inclusion Collaborative has made significant strides in highlighting and addressing inequitable practices in our education system statewide. Learning and listening and applying information in ways that make an impact are crucial to how we continue to improve and succeed, and are key to understanding how to engage our most vulnerable students. This year, the added complexity of distance learning during a pandemic has emphasized the dire need to have robust internet services and devices for all students so that they can participate in, engage with, and be successful in their learning. Digital inclusion is a crucial part of the conversation about equity, and we must continue to leverage partnerships with city and county leaders, as well as public and private organizations, to provide and maintain these services to our students. In our time together, There will be opportunities for you to learn from and collaborate with peers, develop relationships across agencies to support inclusive practices, receive important data, and see various evidence-based practices, and have focused conversations. Guidance for developing strong, sustainable, and inclusive practices, policies, and opportunities for professional development will be provided. In the spirit of guiding this dialogue, I am delighted to unveil the Ways to Equity Playbook, a navigation tool that can be used to identify equity needs throughout organizations, with a primary focus on African American students, English learners, and students with disabilities. The playbook provides many pathways and avenues to facilitate conversations that serve to focus, improve cohesion, and build a common language and practice around equity, while maintaining a universal perspective for all students. The Ways to Equity Playbook is featured as a session in our conference program. The conference program includes varying topics that are meant to inform and inspire. You'll hear from guest speakers about their own experiences in applying evidence-based practices, including the Universal Design for Learning, a framework for learning for all students, and learn how we used existing concepts and structures to guide instruction during this pandemic, empowering and transforming children's early learning experiences with a culturally responsive lens of inclusion. I encourage you to have courageous conversations that not only identify and address systemic inequities, but create a climate that empowers our most marginalized students. I invite you to participate and engage in the conference sessions by topic that we are honored to host this year, including cultural responsiveness, equity and access, health and wellness, and partnerships. There are also sessions categorized according to student age groups, including birth through 5 years, middle school through higher ed, and TK through 6th grade, as well as sessions that are intended for use with students of all ages. We are here in solidarity to champion and support this effort. The Santa Clara County Office of Education is committed to serving our students, and we strive to provide positive opportunities in learning for all of them. I know that this is a vision that you share, and I thank you again for joining us for these 2 days of learning, conversation, and reflection. Together, we can give all of our students the tools necessary to thrive in school and in life. You will be inspired, you will be encouraged, and we hope you will be transformed. Thank you for your participation, commitment, and work to ensure inclusivity and equity in education, which will transform the lives of all of our students.
Welcome everyone to the 7th Annual Inclusion Collaborative State Conference. My name is Kathy Wahl, Director of the Inclusion Collaborative, and I am delighted you are joining us. If this is your first conference with us, welcome. If you are joining us again, welcome back. For the past years, we have always had a virtual component for our annual conference, and this year, 2020, we are exclusively virtual. This year, our state conference theme is Inclusioneers Transform. We know firsthand that inclusion can truly transform all children. All children learn better together. They develop stronger social emotional skills, they learn to respect differences, and develop better understanding and acceptance of diversity when learning together. By working together, we can provide the tools and strategies needed for all students to thrive and be transformed by inclusion. This year, given the many challenges we have all experienced, we have had to be even more intentional and creative in providing supports needed for every student to succeed. Distance learning, cohort learning, asynchronous, these are all terms we have had to learn about. Our experience providing education during a global pandemic has really highlighted the multitude of inequities that exist in our educational system today. So much so that this year the Inclusion Collaborative team has developed a new focus which I'd like to share with you. Through an empathy lens, the Inclusion Collaborative works towards anticipating and addressing systemic barriers to educational advancement and cultural sustainment of all marginalized student groups, regardless of ability. In the next 2 days, our amazing conference presentations, 55 in total, will focus on equity, inclusion, and building that sense of belonging that all of our students need. I would like to thank the many organizations and individuals who have supported the annual Inclusion State Conference. I would personally like to thank Laurie Vanderplug, Director of the Office of Special Education Programs for the U.S. Department of Education, for her conference welcome. By the way, this is her second virtual welcome at our conference, and we are truly honored. I also want to take a moment and thank our Santa Clara County Board of Education. Thank you to this group of people for all of your support to the Inclusion Collaborative. Our biggest supporter and champion for the Inclusion Collaborative is our own County Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Mary Ann Dewan. Dr. Dewan works tirelessly supporting equity and inclusion, not only for our own county, but also statewide. I am so appreciative of her support and leadership, and she makes inclusion happen. Another inclusion champion and friend to the Inclusion Collaborative is Mrs. Charmaine Warmenhoven, who has contributed greatly for the past 15 years, both as an advisor and a funder. Thank you, Charmaine. We couldn't have done it without you. I would also like to thank Dr. Gary Waddell, our Associate Superintendent of the Equity and Educational Progress Division that houses the Inclusion Collaborative. I couldn't work for a more supportive individual. Thank you, Gary. Last but not least, I must thank all of our Inclusion Collaborative staff who have made this annual event a reality. Without them, we would not be here. I especially need to highlight Myra Montanez, our conference coordinator, who has been able to pivot to a virtual format just this spring when it became evident that there would be no in-person activities. She has worked 24/7 to make this conference a reality. Thank you, Myra. I also need to highlight Sung Park, who single-handedly developed our website platform that we are using to stream and record 6 conference sessions at one time. An amazing feat that only he could make happen. Thank you, Sung Park. Now, just a few housekeeping items I'd like to review with you. Please be sure to review your schedule. It's our event website, and it has everything that you need for this conference in it. We will be recording the majority of our sessions this year, and they'll be available on our YouTube site, hopefully close to Thanksgiving. To access CEUs, please refer to the resources section on Schedule. We will have online evaluations provided to you via our Schedule website. Please be sure to provide feedback for us. And just so you know, we will be sending our virtual swag link to anyone who has completed the conference evaluation. We truly want to thank also our many sponsors this year: First 5 Santa Clara County, Strong Start, California One, Lakeshore, The Discovery Source, Psych Services, WEAC, Brooks Publishing, just to name a few. Thank you for your support. Our hope this year is that you will learn and reflect on the sessions you attend. We also want you to become re-energized and motivated to continue this important work, even during these unprecedented times. We want to thank you all for attending this year. Please enjoy the 2020 Inclusion Collaborative State Conference. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mr. Jonathan Mooney. He is an amazing advocate for diversity and inclusion. I first heard him speak in 2018, and I am so happy that he was able to be our keynote speaker today. Mr. Mooney is an award-winning writer, an entrepreneur, and an activist who did not learn to read until he was 12 years of age. By the time he was 23, he had established himself as one of the foremost leaders in neurodiversity and the learning revolution. Jonathan's work has been widely recognized for its innovation and social impact, and again, I am so happy to have him here today. Please help me welcome Mr. Jonathan Mooney.
Well, hey, everybody. My name is Jonathan Mooney, and I am so deeply honored and privileged to be participating in your important work and social mission today. Now, before I do my thing, I just have a few pieces of housekeeping, if you will bear with me. First and foremost, I need to say this right off the bat. I am not somebody who sits still very well. And I know I'm not alone in that either. So I want to empower you, if you are like me out there, to do whatever you need to do to have a good learning experience during my session. If that means you need to be pacing around the room during my talk, no problem. If that means you mean to be multitasking, it's all good. I myself may wander off in the middle of my presentation, and you all will be accepting, inclusive, and accommodating of that, I'm sure. But in all seriousness, you do what you need to do to have a good learning experience today. Okay, second piece of housekeeping. I want to take a moment and recognize the conference planning staff. It's hard to put on a conference under any circumstances, but it is a huge pain in the ass to do a conference during the circumstances that we are living through now. So I want to recognize the conference organizers for their hard work and their important work. And I'm so deeply honored to be a part of it. But more importantly, I want to take a moment and recognize you out there, the practitioners who are on the front lines of building a more inclusive world. And that work is more important than ever. Individuals with atypical brains and bodies, they get the short end of the stick. They have the highest unemployment rates out of any minority community in the world. They have some of the highest incarceration rates out of any minority group in the world. And that is just plain and simple wrong. That is a form of social injustice. And you all are on the front lines of fighting that social injustice and building a more inclusive world for all. So I thank you for the work that you do. I thank you for the opportunity to be a small part of that work today. Okay, so with all that said and done, let me kind of get right to it. I was asked here today to share two things with y'all. On one hand, I was asked to share my professional experience of being an advocate for young folks with atypical brains and bodies. And, I've done nothing in my professional life other than that work, working directly with individuals with atypical brains and bodies, and then fighting for their rights in our systems and our institutions. So I was asked here today to talk about that professional journey with you and share the core principles that I believe in and fight for every day as an advocate. But I was also asked here today to share with y'all something more important than my professional experience, and that's my personal experience of being a young person with an atypical brain who struggled in school and beyond because of how those differences were treated. And I did struggle. I was the kid who had such a hard time sitting still in elementary school that I spent most of the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway. You know, I was the kid who had such a hard time keeping his mouth shut that I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist, in the principal's office. And, you know, I was the kid who had such a hard time with reading, and specifically a torturous time reading out loud, that I spent most of the day hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. You know, as was mentioned in my introduction, I did not learn to read until I was 12. Couldn't read until I was 12 years old. Growing up, I had every label you could imagine. You know, I was called the bad kid. I was called the dumb kid. I was called the crazy kid. And eventually I became the special ed kid. You know, I was diagnosed with a continuum of language-based learning differences in third grade, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and others. I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of different behavioral and executive functioning disorders, ADHD and beyond, in fifth grade. And I dropped out of school for about a year in sixth grade. That year when I left school, I struggled with a number of mental health challenges. I struggled with anxiety, I struggled with depression, and I had a plan for suicide. So y'all can imagine, by the time I got back into school and I was facing down my adolescence, there were all sorts of low expectations that surrounded me. Low expectations that too often surround folks with atypical brains and bodies. You know, I heard it all. I was told I'd be a high school dropout. I was told I'd be unemployed. I was told I'd end up in jail. But, you know, I transcended those low expectations. Needless to say, those very hopeful prophecies did not come to pass in my life. Opposed to being a high school dropout, I became a college graduate. And opposed to being unemployed, I became a writer and entrepreneur. And opposed to being an inmate, most importantly, I became an advocate, somebody who has dedicated his entire professional life to making the world a better place for folks with atypical brains and bodies. So I was asked here today to fuse those two things, my professional journey and my personal experience, and reflect upon what we know transforms life outcomes for young people with different brains and bodies. And we know more than ever from personal testimonies and empirical research that it is inclusive practices that put young people with different brains and bodies on a path towards thriving. But not only is it a set of inclusive practices, it's more importantly a commitment to a set of inclusive principles. And that's what I want to reflect on with you today. You know, inclusion is not a pedagogical approach, though there is pedagogy attached to it. Inclusion is not necessarily about the resources we put to it, though resources matter. Inclusion is fundamentally a paradigm shift in the way that we think about the value and importance of cognitive and physical difference. And that paradigm shift helps us not just think differently about young people who learn differently, it helps us act differently on the day to day. So I want to talk about the fundamental principles of inclusion that, as noted earlier, transcends the mode of instruction, whether that's virtual, whether that's hybrid, whether that's in person. We can't be doing inclusion unless we are following three core principles. And I want to share from my perspective what those three core principles are with you right now. So let me start first and foremost. What for me is the foundation of an inclusive educational experience, the foundation of an inclusive philosophy. You know, inclusion can only happen when we redefine who or what we call the problem. You know, for most of human history, we have called people with disabilities the problem. You know, folks with atypical brains and bodies were demonized in biblical times and in biblical texts. In the 19th century, people with disabilities were treated with charity and sympathy. And in the 20th century, people with atypical brains and bodies are seen through a pathology lens as broken or sick. We put the problem in the person. But the reality is, the problem is not the person with a difference. The problem is not their limitations, whether they be cognitive or physical. The problem is in the way that the person with a difference is treated in systems and institutions that privilege certain brains and bodies over other brains and bodies in their institutional practices. Let me use my life experience as a way to illuminate that paradigm shift of where we locate the problem. Let's take this thing that I was told was my problem. This thing called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? ADHD, you know. The problem is inside of me. You know, hang out with the words used to describe my brain. Jonathan has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? Something's wrong with me. But the reality is, this thing that everyone called a problem inside of me was really a difference in the truest sense of the word. Now, a difference with challenges and limitations, of course, right? I'm not naive about the challenges that come with having my brain difference, you know? I struggle with organization. I struggle with executive functioning tasks. I have explored the feasibility of stapling my car keys to my forehead, right? Like, I got that, you know? Those are very real challenges, and those are very real limitations, right? As I was saying, you know, what goes hand in hand with those very real challenges and those very real limitations are a whole bunch of very real strengths, gifts, and talents, right? You know that there's research that shows that folks with atypical attention spans have better problem solving and entrepreneurial skills than the general population. Came across a research study recently that showed that EMTs, emergency medical professionals, firemen and women with ADD are better at their job than so-called normal EMTs. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, your house is on fire. You want that person to have ADD, right? Forget paying attention. Come get my cat, you know? So, this thing that we have called an inherent problem in a person is in reality a difference. ADD, my difference wasn't my problem. My problem was the way the difference was treated. My problem was the school desk. How in God's name could a school desk be a kid's problem? Well, let me immerse you into my relationship with the school desk, and it is a fraught relationship, right? You know, for some students, the school desk is a benign piece of school furniture. For me, the school desk might as well be a form of enhanced interrogation that would make Dick Cheney proud, right? Here's my experience at the school desk. This is first grade, this is 12th grade, this is college, doesn't matter. I see that desk, I see that chair, and before I even sit in it, my hands start to sweat. My face gets all red, because I know after 5 seconds at the school desk, my foot's going to start bouncing, right? 10 seconds, both feet start bouncing. 15 seconds, oh, I'm going to bust out the drums. 15 minutes, oh, it's all over, right? I'm the kid trying to take his leg and put it behind his neck, right? And that kid is shamed because we have a set of institutional practices and cultural norms that confuses or conflates being the good kid with being the compliant kid. And if you're not the compliant kid according to those norms, who raises their hand and sits still, something is wrong with you. You know, I got that message at home. You know, every night at the dinner table with my father, it was, Jonathan, stop it, stop it, stop it. What is wrong with you? And I got that message in some of my classrooms. Not all of my classrooms, don't get me wrong, but some of them. I'll never forget. I had a teacher in 2nd grade named Mrs. C, you know, and I've had many, many gifted, brilliant teachers in my life who I will celebrate with you today. Mrs. C was not one of those, okay? Mrs. C, when my foot was bouncing, would stop class. She would point at me. All of the kids would look at me, and she would say at the top of her lungs, Jonathan, what is your problem, right? We put the problem in the person, when the reality is, as I mentioned, ADD is a difference with good things and bad things. The problem was the institutional privileging of the kid who can sit still over the kid who can't. And the problem is the sense of shame and social stigma that comes from being called the problem. That's really the problem. Let me give you one of the best examples of the social stigma that happens pervasively, daily, for young folks with atypical brains and bodies. And this example comes from Green Bay, Wisconsin, right? I spent a lot of time talking to young folks, one of the best things I do with my time on this earth. And back in the day, I gave a talk to 3rd graders in Green Bay. And when I walked in to give that presentation, I could see from the front of the room, in the back of the room, a set of boxes made out of bookshelves, right? And in those boxes, about 3 feet tall, I could see one kid jumping up and down. Now, that's not a sight you see every day. So I turned to the teacher and I said, hey, man, what's up with the box, right? What's going on? And the guy looked at me and he said, Jonathan, that's Jack. I said, you have a Jack in the box? Are you kidding me? They had put poor little Jack in the back of the room in a box. Hey, I don't got to belabor the point. ADD ain't Jack's problem. The box is Jack's problem. Difference, disabled by context, and the privileging of certain brains over other brains and bodies. That's really the problem. And the same is true with my so-called learning disabilities. You know, y'all know better than I do that the vast majority of young folks who receive special education services, IEP or 504 plans, are young folks who are labeled learning disabled, right? And that label, again, implies that something is wrong with them, the problems inside of them. But the reality is, just like ADD in my life, this thing people called a learning disability, dyslexia, was a difference in the truest sense of that term. Again, a difference with very real and very neurobiologically based limitations and weaknesses. I'm not naive or in denial about my very real limitations. Y'all know that I struggle with reading to this day. My phonetic awareness is in the 12th percentile. Y'all know that I struggle with writing. I spell at a 3rd grade level. I still confuse words that look alike, you know, who and how look the same to me. Horse and house look the same to me. When I went to college, I thought my university offered a course in orgasmic chemistry. Okay. Imagine my disappointment on the first day of that class, right? So I got it. Those are very real challenges. But what goes hand in hand with those challenges are a whole bunch of good things that we don't talk enough about. Y'all know that young folks with a continuum of things we call learning disabilities are often more creative than the general population. So the problem wasn't the dyslexia. The problem was the way dyslexia was treated in a culture and institution that had a narrow definition of what constituted intelligence. The problem wasn't my reading challenges. The problem was being made to feel stupid because I didn't have the so-called good, normal brain. That's really the problem. And we have a national crisis on our hands right now of young folks leaving school dumb, with and without labels, because we have a narrow definition of intelligence that leaves so many people out. We confuse or conflate being good at school with being smart. But y'all know better than anybody else that those two things are very different. Don't know about you, but some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, they didn't read well, they didn't write well, they didn't do school well, but guess what? They could rebuild the car engine from scratch, right? And those people are just as valuable, just as intelligent as somebody with a 4.0. But unfortunately, in our culture and institutions, the school brain is the right brain. And if you don't got that brain, you find yourself in the dumb group. Don't know if y'all remember the dumb group, right? Let me say it differently, because we have these tracks to this day. It's not malicious, it's not inherently intentional, but they are there. I'm sure y'all encounter reading groups in your practice, right? Let me ask you a question about those reading groups. Is it ever hard to tell which reading group is the smart group and which reading group is the dumb group? It's not hard to tell, right? Let me put it this way. When I was growing up, everybody knew that my group was the dumb group because my group was a bird that did not fly, okay? And I was chilling out all day long reading C-Spot Run, and everybody knew that the condors were the smart group because the condors were reading War and Peace, right? And the worst thing about it is not only did I know I was in the dumb group, but guess who else knew I was in the dumb group? Everybody else knew I was in the dumb group. Some of the worst memories of my life were going over to the other side of the room to pick up my little book. And let's be honest, C-Spot Run, not a bad book, right? Nice narrative structure, nice moral tale, but you don't want to be caught dead with Spot when you are 14 years old now, do you, right? So I got a gauntlet to walk. I'm going to put Spot in my shirt. I'm going to put Spot in my backpack, because as I walk by all the other kids, I hear it. I hear, Jonathan, go back to your dumb reading group. Jonathan, go back to your stupid reading group. And then I hear a word which should be treated as the moral equivalent of a racial slur, but too often is not. I hear, Jonathan, go back to your retarded reading group. We privilege some brains over others. We institutionalize that privilege in our practices and in our actions daily. And those messages that there's one way to be smart wounds people deeply. So the problem isn't my dyslexia. The problem is the way the dyslexia was treated. The problem is not in the person, but in the interaction between person and context. And you know what? You may be thinking to yourself, well, hey, that's true for attentional and learning differences. But if there's one thing that I've learned, is that's true for a continuum of atypical brains and bodies. Let me give you an example of that, right? I wrote this book back in the day called The Short Bus, And for this book, I bought an old short bus, the kind that often, not always, but often takes young people with atypical brains and bodies to special education programs. Little noted fact, the short bus is one of the last forms of federally funded segregated transportation that we tolerate. So I bought one of those old short buses. I drove around the United States, listening to the experience of people and learning from people who literally or metaphorically rode the short bus. And I remember one of the first young people I met with on that journey, which changed my life and sense of self, was a young man named Wilson. And Wilson, he had significant physical disabilities. He had cerebral palsy. He breathed through a respirator. He used a full-time mobility device and had full-time health nursing assistants. He had significant physical limitations. So I remember my interview with Wilson. My first question I asked him was, hey, Wilson, if you could change one thing in your life, if you had the magic wand, what would it be? And I remember asking that question and thinking to myself, the guy's going to say, well, you know what? I wish I wasn't in a wheelchair. I wish I wasn't on a respirator. Hey, I wish I didn't have cerebral palsy. And Wilson looked right at me. And you know what he said? He said, I wish people wouldn't stare at me. The problem's not in the person. It's in the way the person is treated by an ableist set of practices that has been institutionalized in our culture, our media, in our systems. That's the problem. And inclusion can't happen until we recognize that paradigm shift of where we put the problem. Because when we put the problem in the person, we're stuck in a pathology model trying to fix so-called broken people. When we put the problem in the person, we're stuck in a charity model trying to do for others, opposed to empowering them for themselves. But when we reframe where the problem is, it doesn't just help us think differently about people with differences, it leads us to acting differently. And that brings me to the second foundational principle of inclusion. And that second foundational principle of inclusion flows naturally from reframing the problem. And in my life, that second principle was embodied by my mom. So I want to tell you about my mom real quick, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Colleen Mooney, right? Give you a mental image of my mom. A lot of folks underestimated my mom and dismissed her, frankly. They dismissed her and underestimated her for a variety of different reasons. On one hand, my mom, not a tall woman, right? On a good day in high heels on her tippy toes, she's like 4'11", little Irish bulldog, right? So people kind of looked down on her, looked past her, right? My mom was also looked down upon because of her socioeconomic background. My mom, she struggled in school. She had unaddressed learning differences, and she had many of the struggles that I ended up having. My mom never went to college. She had my brother when she was 17, my sister when she was 19, and my other sister when she was 21. Found herself a single mom on public assistance. So people dismissed her for those reasons. And lastly, my mom was dismissed because she had this very funny voice. My mom has a very high-pitched, squeaky voice. She totally sounds like Minnie Mouse, right? My mom totally sounds like Minnie Mouse. So she was dismissed, right? But people dismissed my mom at their own peril, because while she wasn't tall, she didn't go to college, she sounded like Minnie Mouse. My mother cursed like a truck driver. And let me ask you a question. If you were a principal or a teacher doing wrong by her son, did you want cursing Minnie Mouse in your office? The answer to that question, if you are at all confused, is no. Okay, but guess where my mom was? Every day things were going wrong for her son. Oh, she was in that office. How did we know she was in that office? Because every dog in the neighborhood was running away, right? Only bats could hear her high-pitched obscenities. Glass was shattering. My mom understood something, And this insight my mom has is the second principle of inclusion. She understood that for me to thrive in life, I didn't need somebody to fix me. I needed somebody to fight for and with me. Now, that may sound like a distinction without a difference. But let me tell you, the difference between fixing and fighting for is the distinction that matters. You know, that fix it model is so deeply entrenched in the way that we think about atypical brains and bodies. And the origin of that fix it model comes from putting the problem in the person. Jonathan has attentional problem. Let's remediate his attentional problems. Wilson has cerebral palsy. Let's remediate to the extent that we can his physical limitations. It's a fix the person model. And my mom rejected that. She understood that for me to thrive in life, I didn't need somebody to fix me, but somebody to be an advocate for me. And we know that more than ever. We know that young folks with atypical brains and bodies who thrive in their adult life. And what I mean by thriving is not going to a fancy school, but having a job, being in relationships, having community, having independence and interdependence when they choose it, having their own life. Thriving requires them to have an advocate in their corner, requires that we cultivate self-advocacy as one of our primary objectives for every single young person. We should be cultivating self-advocacy by aspiring for student-led IEPs. Hey, guess what? If a young person can't lead an IEP, how are they going to navigate Social Security, the bureaucracy that faces them? Let's use those as teachable moments where young people are empowered to know themselves, fight for themselves, and have a voice in the process, living every day the disability rights mantra of nothing about us without us. That self-advocacy behavior is often more important than traditional skill sets that we spend our time remediating and cultivating. But not only do we need, on our journey of advocacy as professionals, to be cultivating self-advocacy and efficacy, we need to be fighting for students' rights to learn differently. We need to be fighting for not the kid to change, but the environment around the kid. You know, my mom would say to anyone who would listen, she would say, hey, if my son doesn't learn the way he's taught, well, guess what? Teach the way he learns. A mantra, an insight of the special education movement my mom was echoing the idea that everyone learns differently and everyone has a right to learn differently. And we got to fight for that right. And we need to fight for that right to learn differently more than ever. So as you all commit to being in young people's corner, to being an ally and an advocate for equity and inclusion, please fight for their rights for services. You know, young folks across the socioeconomic continuum, but frankly, more pervasively, low-income young folks of color with disabilities don't get the services and resources that are their rights by law. We got to fight for that. In this age of COVID-19, we need to fight for the most vulnerable young people receiving the services that they need. And if we can do it in a safe and responsible way, many of those services should be in person. Those are the things we need to fight for. But you know what? We got to go beyond fighting for services, because that's still about trying to fix a person a little bit. And we need to be advocates for accommodations, right? You know, accommodations are different from services. Accommodations, as enumerated in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of this year. Accommodations are fundamentally about changing the environment and not the person. They're about building curb cuts to create access for the diversity of brains and bodies that we all know is paradoxically normal. Be an advocate for that. My journey was fundamentally facilitated by educators like you who fought for my rights for speech to text, for my rights for text to speech technology. My journey was facilitated by educators who fought for equitable access to assessment. In my case, it was time extensions on exams. In other students' case, it's portfolio-based assessment. So we look at the totality of a young person and not just their score on one test on one day. Those accommodations matter. They matter in school settings, but perhaps even more importantly, in the 21st century, they matter in the workplace. That we be ambassadors and advocates for the idea that our corporations have a civic responsibility to be accommodating of cognitive and physical differences under the ADA in their places of business. Those accommodations matter. But ultimately, guess what? We got to be advocates for more than just accommodations, because accommodation has a little bit of a negative connotation to it, doesn't it? You know, accommodations is kind of like tolerance, you know? We tolerate something that we're not all that happy about, right? Let me put it this way. When my mother-in-law comes to town, I don't celebrate her visit. I accommodate her visit, right? So we need to go beyond accommodations, and we need to be ferocious advocates for universal design of all systems, of all classrooms, of communities, of places of work. Universal design is grounded in the reality of human difference. Universal design is new words for something that folks in special education have been preaching for 50 years. The idea that everyone has a right to an individualized education, and that individuals are by definition different from each other. And if we can build universally designed classrooms, making speech to text not just for some kids, but all kids, making portfolio-based assessment not just for some kids, but all kids, every single learner, every single human will do better. But fighting for universal design, it also requires us to understand and be advocates for social justice for people with disabilities. I mentioned in my opening that folks with atypical brains and bodies, hey, they get the short end of the stick, and they've been getting that short end for a long time. This is a group of human beings who were targeted in the 1930s during the eugenics movement for extermination. That's not my word. That's the word of renowned scientists from the 1930s and beyond. This is a group of folks who have been warehoused and segregated in special schools and special places, riding special buses for too long. We need to find common cause right now. And we need to understand the common ground in the social justice movements for the rights of Black and brown young folks and human beings, and the rights of people with atypical brains and bodies, because we have common mission. You know, folks with atypical brains and bodies are the victims of police brutality at exponential rates. According to the Ruderman Foundation, officer-involved shootings, the common denominator is not just that those folks are people of color, Black and brown, but 85% of the time, they are also people with disabilities, with neurodiversities. This is an important moment for us as a community, as we fight for inclusion and social justice. It can't just be for some folks. It has to be for all folks. And our work as advocates, as my mom articulated, was to build a more just and equitable world, a world that doesn't just work for some people, but works for all people. Okay, I got one more for you, right? I told you there were three kind of foundations for inclusion. You know, number one, redefine the problem. You know, the problem isn't physical limitations, cognitive differences. The problem is the way that those are treated in institutions that privilege certain brains and bodies over others. Number two, be advocates against that, you know, because that ain't right, right? Be advocates for services where people are denied it, be advocates for accommodations, be advocates for universal design, and ultimately justice and equity for people who live and learn differently. And last but not least, inclusion requires us to extricate ourselves from the deficit paradigm that informs a lot of our practices and processes when it comes to people with different brains and bodies. You know, when I was a kid, I heard so much about what was wrong with me. I had no idea that there was anything right about me. You know, when I was a kid, I had the IEP, right? I know y'all know the IEP, the Individuals with Education's Plan, right? Individualized Education Plan. Got to be real about that thing. You know, NSA, KGB got nothing on the IEP, right? You know, they've been doing deep intel on me my whole life, and it is not good news in that file. These are deficit-based documents that lead to deficit-based processes and practices. You know, a good friend of mine, former Secretary of Special Education at the U.S. Department of Education, Thomas Ayer, Professor Emeritus at Harvard's Graduate School of Education now. Tom studies the files, right? The 504 plans, the IEP plans, the response to intervention plans, whatever we want to call them, right? He studies those. And his research shows that for every one strength, asset, capacity that's mentioned in those files, there are upwards of 25 deficits, disorders, or weaknesses. Imagine that being your life, you know? Imagine going to work and hearing all about what you can't do, not what you can do. Imagine coming home and hearing from your loved ones all about what's wrong with you and not what is right with you. It's a deficit orientation that is demoralizing for human beings, and it's not right, and it must change. I know the power of challenging that deficit model in my own life. You know, I had a teacher in third grade. His name was Mr. R. You know, I'll tell you about him real quick. Mr. R, he was relentlessly committed to the idea that every single human being has strengths, gifts, and talents. And his job was to find those gifts and talents, to name them, and make sure other people saw them and to build upon them. That was his mission in life. So he would ask every single young person in his class, he'd say, hey, what are you good at? 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 And, you know, when he asked me that question, guess what I would say? I would say, Mr. R, I'm not good at anything, man. You know, I was stuck in that deficit model. But you know what? Mr. R never gave up on me. He never quit. And one day he came to me and he said, hey, Jonathan, man, I've been watching you and you are wrong about yourself. Other people have been wrong about you. You are so good at telling stories. Now, sometimes they're inappropriate stories you tell, but I don't care. You are so good at telling stories that you could be a writer. I was 9 years old. Nobody had ever said that to me before. A writer, Mr. R? Are you out of your goddamn mind? I can't spell, man. And the guy looked right at me and he said, Jonathan, in my class, screw spelling. Screw spelling, man. Yeah, you should have seen me jump out of my body for the first time in my life. Somebody said, forget what you can't do and focus on what you can do. And I'll tell you, that was a revelation in my sense of self. And it was a revolution in my education and in my future. Because we spend so much time talking about what is wrong. To hear that I had something to give in the world mattered more than anything. So be that Mr. R for somebody. That's my challenge to you. Be that Mr. R for a young person in your practice. You can do that tomorrow. Be that Mr. R for a family. Because I'll tell you, that deficit model surrounds families all the time, where parents are blamed and judged. Be that Mr. R for a colleague. Be that Mr. R for one of your loved ones at home. Be that person who finds the good and celebrates the good when everyone else sees the bad. Because if you do that, you will change a life. But I got another challenge for you, right? We got to go beyond just talking about the strengths and talents of every single learner. We have to make time in their day to build the strengths, gifts, and talents. You know, I think we've gotten kind of good at talking about how we're all different. We all got good things about us, right? But then our practice doesn't match the rhetoric, you know? Kids come to school in kindergarten, you know, and they're told that they're all special snowflakes. We're all different. We're all special snowflakes. And then the bell rings and it turns into, now sit your special snowflake ass down and get ready for the state standardized test, you special snowflake, right? So our rhetoric and our practice often doesn't match. You know, we spent in my life most of my time in the day outside of school on the weekends trying to fix my problem, you know, working on the spelling and the reading. And the problem with that is it left no time to build on the interests, on the talents, and on the strengths. So my challenge to you is make that time. Name the good in every student. Invest in the good of every student some way, every day, every week, because that is going to be their path towards thriving in life. And every kid's got something. You know, if I've learned one thing in my 20 years of working with young folks with atypical brains and bodies, it's every single young person has some interest or talent that they can use to organize an education and a life. Let me give you a good example of that. You know, one of the things I do in here in LA, where I live, is I work on a social venture called Thrively. And Thrively is an educational platform that's all about challenging the deficient model. It helps young people find their strengths and talents, and then it helps them build an educational journey around those strengths and talents with content and educational opportunity and access, so they can go on an interest and strength-based journey of transformation for themselves. And one of the first young people I ever worked with doing this strength-based work was a kid named Juan. Tell you about Juan real quick, right? Juan was a rough kid, you know. Juan had been arrested when he was 13 for running a 50-person drug ring in South Central Los Angeles. Juan was a serious narcotics dealer. Juan struggled in school growing up. Juan was in special education throughout his education. And he dropped out of school when he was 13. Couldn't read, couldn't write, felt stupid, crazy, lazy. So he joined the family business, right? What else was he supposed to do? He went to jail, served his time, got out, came to my program, sat across from me at the interview and said, "Hey, Jonathan, I don't want to be that person. I know what I did was wrong, but what am I supposed to do? I am dumb," he said to me. "I am not good at anything." And I looked at Juan. I thought about my journey. I thought about his journey. I thought about Mr. R in my life. And I looked at Juan and I said, "Hey, Juan, dumb, 50-person drug ring. You're an entrepreneur, brother." Now, I was honest with Juan. I said, "Hey, man, we got to get you a different product, you know. We got to get you some stocks or some sneakers or something to sell. But right there are skills and talents that you can use to build a better life." So Juan enrolled in a small business set of courses at Harbor Community College down here in LA because he was a gifted entrepreneur. Juan also enrolled in graphic design courses because he was a gifted artist misapplying his creativity onto the side of your building, right? And Juan merged the two, and he created a small creative service business that worked with advertisers trying to engage urban millennial youth. And Juan became the first in his family to go to and graduate from college. But perhaps most importantly, Juan became the first in his family to earn a legitimate living wage. Did we fix what was wrong with Juan? Nuh-uh. We scaled what was right. And every young person deserves that opportunity. Every young person needs a Mr. R to find the good and challenge the deficit model. And every young person needs an opportunity to take those strengths and talents, apply them every day, build on them, and build a pathway to a better life for themselves, their family, and their community. Okay, I want to conclude. And in concluding, I want to come back to what makes everything I said today, not just word salad or abstractions on a whiteboard, but real in the world. Inclusion is a set of principles, whether it's on a Zoom call, whether it's a hybrid or in person. It's a set of core philosophical commitments and beliefs about human beings' value. It is about redefining the problem. The problem is not in the person, but in the context. It's not about fixing people. It's about changing the context through advocacy, fighting for services, accommodation, universal design, and equity and justice for people who have been left behind. And inclusion is about flipping that deficit model that surrounds young people and being Mr. R's for every single person you encounter. But what makes all of that happen in the real world is the power of people, not a program, not a curriculum, but the people who do this every single day, like you. That's what matters most. I came across a research study that I love recently, and it was a study that followed a bunch of vulnerable young folks from the South Side of Chicago. It followed them from the time that they were first identified as at risk. I prefer at promise, but the research says at risk, when they were engaged in special education, juvenile justice systems, etc. And it followed them from the time that they were, in their adolescence to the time that they were in their mid-20s. It's the largest longitudinal study of its kind. And the point of the study was to try to figure out what were the interventions or services that helped a small group of those young people beat the odds when too many of them became the statistics we know too well. And that research study unequivocally concluded that the intervention or service that mattered most, that the young folks who thrive in life had in common, was they all had one meaningful adult other than their immediate family in their life. And 95% of the time, guess who that meaningful adult was? It was you. It was a teacher. 95% of the time. It was an in-classroom teacher. It was a special education teacher. It was a assistant teacher. It was a bus driver who said hello to the children in the morning and saw them for who they are. It was a janitor who was kind to the kid in the hallway. It was the people involved in education. It was the people like you. That's an amazing statistic. Not 5, not 4, not 3, not 2. One person can change somebody's life. Now, I was blessed to have a couple of those folks in my corner, but I want to end my time telling you about one more, because this person embodies what does it mean to be that meaningful adult beyond what I've spoken to thus far. And this person, his name is Father Young. I met Father Young in my journey at an inflection point. Hey, I could have went left. I went right instead. I met him at my first university before I transferred to my alma mater, Brown University. I went to a place called Loyola Marymount University here in LA. And I went to LMU, I'll be real with you, to be an athlete. That was it, I went on soccer scholarship. I got through high school by playing ball. And all I thought I could do, my only value in the world, I thought, was my ability to play soccer. So I went to LMU, and I wanted nothing to do with school. I was the stupid, crazy, lazy kid who could kick a ball, and that was it. And throughout my freshman year at LMU, the soccer coach, as he should, made us go around to the different academic departments, listen to their presentations, and figure out what we wanted to major in moving forward, right? So I'd go to these different presentations. I'd sit in the back of the room, and I would not listen to a word being said. I was there to major in soccer, right? And then we got to the English department. Never forget this day. And the chair of the department Jesuit priest, Shakespeare scholar named Father Young was up there talking about education and learning like his head was on fire. But more important than that, he told me and us his story. He talked about his alcoholic father, like mine. He talked about his struggles with learning, like mine. I saw myself in him. I saw a better future, and I was inspired. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, "Hey, Father Young, man, you inspired me. You touched me. I think I'm going to be an English major here at LMU. You told my story, but I don't think I can do it." And I told him all about my learning problems. First person I ever told outside my family. And I said, "Hey, I don't think I can do it because of my dyslexia." And the guy looked right at me. And you know what he said? He said, "Son, you're using that as an excuse." And you know what? The guy was right. The bar had been lowered for me my entire life. You know, there was, to paraphrase George W. Bush, a soft bigotry of low expectations that surrounded me and surrounds students like me. I didn't know what it meant to raise the bar because the problem was in me. You know, I was a problem. And so when Father Young said, "No, no, you can do this," it inspired me. And he went on. And he was the first person in my life to talk about accommodations other than my mom. He said, "You can do school differently, right? You can listen to the text. You can dictate. You can get time extensions." Told me all about my rights as a person with a disability. So I walked out of that man's office and I was on cloud nine. I went that day to the other side of campus and I walked into the Dean of Academic Enrollment's office and I said, "Hey, man, I'm going to study me some English literature here at LMU, right? It's game time. Let's do this." And that guy, pulled out my file, you know. Don't know, you all know the file. I know you do. Those IEPs, they follow you around. It was this thick, right? And he flips through it and then he laughs. He said, "English literature? You can't read. You can't write. You can't spell. You should consider something less intellectual, and you shouldn't even be in college." So I walked out of that guy's office and I was deflated like a balloon. Never underestimate your ability, your power to elevate another human being with your words, with your expectations, to help them be their best self, or the power to deflate that human being. You know, I walked out of that man's office and I was the stupid, crazy, lazy kid who could only play soccer again. So I went back to Father Young out of respect to him. And I said, "Hey, man, not going to be an English major here at LMU." And he said, "Why? You were so excited." And I told him, I said, "Hey, that guy over there told me I couldn't do it because of my learning problems." And Father Young was real quiet for a long time. And then he said, in a way that only an old school Jesuit can, he said, "Well, son, I guess you're just going to have to prove that bastard wrong." And the next day, I enrolled in 4 English literature classes. I fought for my rights for accommodations in all of those classes. And that guy who told me I shouldn't be in college, let's just say that he has an autographed copy of all 3 of my books on his desk right now. Prove him wrong, right? I'll be real with you. I'm proud that I proved that guy wrong. I'm proud that I proved Mrs. C and my father wrong. But you know what I am more proud of? I am more proud that I proved Father Young, Mr. R, my mom, all of the people who believed in me and my potential. I am more proud that I proved those people right. And that's what you all are doing every single day. You are out there proving right the belief that every single human being has value. You're out there fighting for the core ethical principle that our institutions have a social obligation to include every single human being. And you're out there every day fighting for every single human being's right to be different. And that fight matters more than ever. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today, of course, but more important than that, thank you so much for the work that you do every day on behalf of young folks with atypical brains and bodies, the important work to build a world that doesn't just work for some, but works for all. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think we now will transition and have an opportunity for questions, comments, and dialogue via your chat feature. I'm here, yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Look, just some context. So, I celebrate my 20th year of advocating on behalf of young folks this year, right when I graduated from college. And from the first presentation I gave until the one I just finished, and every single one in between, I've been talking about challenging that deficit model and that deficit script. And one of the things I am most optimistic about in that 20-year journey and hopeful about is a growing coalition of people. I'm sure many on this conference right now who believe deeply in that paradigm shift. And so the challenge now is not for us to just advocate for that paradigm shift, though we still need to advocate for it because in many circles, we still focus on deficits, not assets. But our work now is bigger than that. And our work now is to put it in practice, as I mentioned. And so what are the tools and processes that we can make real that idea, right? And so I've been searching for that, thinking about that for a long time. And there are a few that I want to share, and then I'm going to answer the question directly about Thrively. So first of all, there is no reason, zero reason, that the testing that is associated with a young person being identified with a neurodiversity, whether that be autism, mental health challenges and differences, learning or attentional differences, and everything in between. That assessment does not have to be purely negative. We should seize that as an opportunity to acknowledge the weaknesses, because I hope everyone heard me clearly. I'm not naive, nor are people in the disability rights movement in denial, so quote unquote, about the very real limitations that come with cognitive and physical differences. So we should use the assessment to name those limitations, talk about those limitations, be honest about those. But the other side of the coin is also there, and that's the good stuff. It would have been a revelation for me to hear when I and my mom, and frankly, a revelation from my mom first, to hear the good stuff in that assessment when it came back, not just the bad stuff. So let's seize that moment to be balanced and to flip the deficit model on its head. Another area, and then I promise I'll get to Thrively in a second, is Iep planning. There is no statutory requirement. And I'm sure the Secretary of Education, who kicked off our conference today for special education from the U.S. Department of Education, would second this. There's no statutory requirement in an IEP that it can only have remediation or deficit-based goals. You can also have strength-based goals in that process, right? And there's a whole movement of folks doing strength-based IEP planning. And if anyone is interested in joining that movement, I'm happy to share and link you to directors of special education, superintendents who are pushing that as a core part of their philosophical commitment to equity and inclusion. And I'll share my email at the conclusion of the call, and I'm happy to link people together. Another area, the IEP meetings. It's very important that these meetings are not just deficit pile-ons, right? Again, don't want to be naive. Let's talk about the challenges and let's have solutions, but let's also make space for talking about a young person's gifts and talents and value to the community, because every person has something. So let's do that. So now that brings me to Thrively, right? So we have these very tactical places to make strength-based education real. We have it in IEP documents, plant processes. We have it in IEP meetings. We have it in assessment. So what would it mean to really try to go to the next level and build an educational pathway around interest and talent, and have that pathway maybe augment what's happening in the school day, or maybe in the most opportune moments, maybe that is their education. And so that brings me to Thrively. So I was really looking for a tool for over 20 years now that could facilitate, discovering a strength, naming that strength, and then building on that strength. And that tool became Thrively. It really did. And so it's an educational platform that provides a strength assessment. The strength assessment goes into a portfolio or profile. So imagine, opposed to the traditional profile that's all about what a kid can't do, this is all a profile about what a kid can do. And then there's linkages to interest-based learning opportunities. That could be video content. That could be an after-school class. That could be a free class online. That could be a mentorship by a business. Whatever it may be, the possibilities are infinite once you get to that piece of the experience. So this is free of cost to families. So it's a good resource. You should check it out. Again, I know I talk quickly. So it is Thrively, which is the word thrive and then L-Y, Thrively. And you can find it online. And you can also feel free to email me if you'd like any more information about that. Again, I'll share my email at the conclusion of our Q&A. Oh, okay, here we are. Got it. Yeah, no problem. So, hey, a couple things before we call it a day. I've, as I mentioned to you, 20 years of being an advocate for young folks. I started this journey speaking anywhere anyone would ask me. Literally, hey, I got 5 chairs and a cafetorium, and you can sleep on my floor. Here's a Greyhound bus ticket. And I'd spent a year of my life doing that, and it's never stopped. And so, in celebration of 20 years of doing this, and in recognition of the cultural moment that we're at, where we need all voices, all hands on deck around equality and inclusion, I'm committing to speaking anywhere and anywhere when I'm asked. So if you're sitting on this call saying, hey, I got a group of young folks who could benefit from this message, we got no budget, don't worry about it. You hit me an email, okay? So my email is one word. It's my name. It's Jonathan Mooney, which is JONATHAN MOONEY at me, which is me.com. So it's Jonathan Mooney, all one word, at me.com. And I welcome your questions, and I welcome your thoughts, and more importantly, I welcome the opportunity to be a partner in your mission and reach and inspire young people to believe in themselves and their potential, and perhaps most importantly, their value in the world, not despite their differences, but because of their differences. So thanks so much. I'll turn it back over to the host, who will officially end my time. Very, very grateful, and I wish you all the best. Oh, thank you. Are we off? We're off the live stream now? Okay, great. Well, thank you.